Are here for the webinar on cultivating culture change, tips and resources for anti-racist Christian formation. And I would just start by saying that we have experience with this, but I think none of us are really experts in that our culture is so steeped in whiteness that it's difficult to be an expert at this point, maybe impossible. And so we're all continually growing and learning how to do anti-racism in our lives, but especially in the church. So I wanted to let you know that this webinar is coming to you from Lifelong Learning at Virginia Theological Seminary. And it's co-offered by the eFormation Learning Community and by Building Faith. We do like to center our work on prayer. We like to make sure that the divine is present in all that we do. So we will start with a word of prayer here, which I've adapted from Let Me Not Look Away, O God, by the Reverend Stephen Charleston, who is Choctaw. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
God of the oppressed, let us not look away from any truth that we should see. Even if it is difficult, let us face the reality in which we live. We do not want to live inside a cosseted dream, imagining that we are the ones who are always right, or believing only what we want to hear. Help us to see the world through other eyes, to listen to voices distant and different, to educate ourselves to the feelings of those with whom we think we have nothing in common. Break the shell of our indifference, O God. Draw us out of our prejudices and show us your wide variety. Let us not look away. Amen. So just as a word of introduction, I am Katherine Malloy. I'm the Director of Christian Formation Resources at Virginia Theological Seminary. So that means that I do things like these webinars and look at different curricula and keep busy with things like that. And I will let the two presenters introduce themselves, if you all would please.
Well, hi, great to be with you this afternoon. I'm the Reverend Melanie Mullen. I serve on the staff of Presiding Bishop Michael Curry, and I am the Episcopal Church Director of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care, which includes all the ways we do intersectional justice in the Jesus movement. And I'm a VTS alum living right in DC, and I'm glad to be here with you on Zoom.
And I'm Reverend Claire Brown. I'm currently serving as the Associate Rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And my work there focuses on outreach and social action. And I'm a grad of Vanderbilt Divinity School in Sewanee. And I'm glad to be part of this conversation.
Thank you all so much. And I am just super excited to have these wonderful panelists with us today. So we do like to give you an idea of sort of where we're going for the time that we're going to be together. So our outline for today is on your screen now. And just a couple of notes for you, especially for those who joined us after I already mentioned this. We are in webinar mode, so we won't see your bunny slippers. We ask that you would please use the chat to share your ideas, to ask questions and such. I do have two colleagues who will be in the chat to help me field and manage that conversation. That's Kara Modisette and Keith Anderson. So if you need help or anything, please do reach out. I also wanted to ask you to please direct your questions to the Q&A so that I can help field those and ask the panelists to answer those. One more thing is, please don't worry, you don't have to take every single note today. You will receive, if you registered online through Eventbrite, you will receive an email tomorrow, typically in the afternoon, with a list of resources and these exact slides, so that you don't have to worry about scratching everything down as we go. So rest assured you will get those. And also just to say that you might be wondering why this webinar, why now? I think that the panelists and I are just aware that even our best intentions in trying to be anti-racist can be really hurtful and insensitive. We also know that doing a book club is wonderful, and being an anti-racist community requires more than an occasional book club. It takes intentional practices and things like that to really change the culture. We're also aware that not all resources align with our own theology or with or are as culturally sensitive as we would want them to be. So we're hoping to give you some tips and ideas to sort of work your way through the pile of resources that to find what would be best for you. And without further ado, I will pass it over to the panelist, Reverend Melanie Mullen.
Thanks so much. It's once again great to be with you all and talking about this at this time. This is probably not even the world that we imagined when we first talked about this in December, as far as having this discussion, as much as a lot of us are dedicated to doing this work on an ongoing basis. So in the few minutes that we have together, I am drawn to just two questions that I hope will stead you as a student, as a disciple on the way that is trying to create a world where there is racial justice for everyone. And for one, it's just thinking about the question we can go back to leaning on again and again, what's your why? And secondly, how do we as sort of the formation people, the leaders, the preachers, the teachers who are helping people in the sense of doing justice rest and be motivated in the sense that in the end, we're not going to know stuff and we're going to need to lean and be comfortable in the places where we don't quite have it all figured out. So what is the why? And once again, just thinking about where we are. 2 weeks ago, the world did not look this way. A week ago, we were probably all up in arms. And yet thinking about what does it look like to have a really clear why when you want to think about how do you articulate what it is to move an institution and a people to a place of racial justice. Last night, we watched the brand new president sign 17 executive orders, and one was one that said we were going to root out systemic racism from programs, institutions, and efforts, and an effort to create divisive, to alleviate divisive trainings and create a place in which people can live in harmony. And so here's a place where the end came out in the beginning. There's a place where we're going to do something as an institution to root out systemic racism. So it's, not a law that's going to change America, but it is a very clear why. Why are we doing something? We've seen what happens when people have different views of reality, different languages they're speaking, and different ends. And so we want to point to a why. And that might happen in the federal government, but also in your church or in your community. When we're starting on a path, and there probably have been some fits and starts wherever you are in the previous cycles, you've probably been through perhaps a little bit of one curriculum or a little bit of one book group. Maybe there's been some outside groups trying things. It never hurts to go back again and ask, well, why are we doing this? And the key for telling that story why is to get over what I think is our very typical Episcopal embarrassment of pointing out the problem. The problem emerges. If you study systems theory, you realize that no problem has just one source. And so to think that you have to go back and ask again, how are we not attending to racially just formation in our church is not a statement or a condemnation you're doing something wrong. It could be a statement of your growing inability to look at the ways that problem is larger and the ways you're coming to understand that in new ways as a community. And secondly, how are we speaking the language? And thinking a little bit about the crisis our country went through the last week. If you were like me and you woke up suddenly to realize there's half the country speaking very different language, even though the words are the same. One thing I want to encourage people to think about is in most of our curricula, there is an attempt to help people become literate in racial justice and racism and what it is to be anti-racist. And yet most of us are just scratching the surface. So in any Episcopal curriculum, which we don't create ourselves, but we point to and lift up, but in lots and lots of other types of curriculum, the emphasis on getting more literate, just like we need to be biblically literate, we need to be literate in this issue. When we think about helping people grow beyond just using the words of racism or anti-racism, but to think about, do you know what double consciousness is? What about power, biological racism? What about racialized bodies and culture and behavior? Are people that are going through your formation programs going to be able to point to those aspects and get a deeper and deeper understanding? So we'll go to the next slide. So here's my my one case study, and I can say this because I lived it. We all sort of walk backwards into our ability to find the right pieces of formation curriculum around racial justice. And I'm going to say pieces because there is no one perfect out the box book club that will do it for you. But here at the parish of St. Paul's, Richmond, where I was on staff as the downtown missioner, one day the church looked around and it was right after a period of great upheaval. The Trayvon Martin court case had just finished. We looked at the windows and we saw this beautiful image. It is Moses, but in the script is depicted as Robert E. Lee. And it says he's got the rippling abs and he's the young Lee leading the Southerners to justice. So when the church decided it was time to revisit, they were a people of justice, but do something again and something more to deal with their way of understanding racial history, they were stumped because the problem seemed really big. So the next slide. So what this church did as a way to enter into finding a formation path for teaching racial justice was it went threefold. Number one, we had to ask the question, we don't know what we don't know. So an openness for everyone to figure it out. Number two, there was a polling of the community to figure out, where are we now? What is it that you know? And what you're seeing here is a multi-generational approach. These are some of the elders and seniors learning how to read racial history documents. And they were learning how to interpret history and fill in things online. The second thing they did, there is a consultant in that picture. We love that we can pull things out the box and we are smart, bright people, but this was a parish where we thought we need more help. We called a consultant to come in and talk about how do we lead community forums, talking about race and slavery. We brought in folks from other parishes and other denominations and even non-church institutions that had learned how to teach bits of this racial history. And finally, those folks are building things together that turn into a book. So we were able to reflect on what we learned with all these pieces. So not one book club, although there was a book club involved with it, not one task, although we had people advising us how to have wonderful forums, how to have new ways and intergenerational approaches to that work. So that's the next slide. So the case study is, if St. Paul's could do it, anyone can, but it's about asking what you need to go, where you need to learn, and bringing in people for help. And the final thing that they learned from this was asking, who is this for? Because in the end, This work is hard. It is difficult. Even the most righteous amongst us, the most well-being, had moments of tears, of breaking down. And the one thing that this community realized is that when the times of stress and trials are brought up, when people want to argue about bending history or doing things that don't go far enough, we came back to one question: who is this for? And in the end, it helped us remind us of right relationship to anchor ourselves in the idea that for some of us, it was, this is the church of Bob or Steve or little Sue. We want her to be comfortable here. We want to make sure this is a community that speaks of authentic relationship and faith. Anchor ourselves again and again. Why are we doing this work? Well, it's for someone. It's for perhaps our youth so that they can feel a part of the community, for our parish's history so that the community will miss us when we're gone because they know we're a place of justice and reconciliation. And finally, asking the who question, make sure that our literacy is relevant for the community. It's great if you're doing some abstract book study, but if you're rooted in a Southern rural context, making sure that your racial justice curriculum brings up those things of a Southern rural context and within your formation are really relevant. And some last slide for me here. So quick do's and don'ts, although it's a hard thing to dip your head in, just knowing that it's going to be hard. For anybody who's teaching or preaching, sort of breathing in, Helen Hessel, who's in our resource list, wrote a book on how to preach about race, mentions that breathing into gratitude as a spiritual practice before you as the teacher or the preacher or even the parent bringing someone into formation is a necessary thing. It just acknowledge the fact that it's going to be difficult, but there is going to be a gift in the exchange which is get over that anxiety and helping other people come along with you know that it's okay, it doesn't feel good all the time, but we're going together. Secondly, isolated communities cannot be just. The hard thing is for the Episcopal Church and most of our parishes, they tend to be homogeneity. They tend to be, by and large, one ethnic group. So you're going to have to do this together. And it might not be appropriate to invite the AME Church for your first book review of reading, Cast or Kende Wiley, but there's got to be a point where you broaden the horizon and use those gifts of proximity and community to help people ground them in their learning with each other. So learning how to be a good host, because most likely you'll be inviting people in or inviting yourself over, will be a way to do that. And finally, don't look for the very best resource. We've lots and lots of Episcopal curriculum. They're all in the resource document and the slides. You might have tried out something like Seeing the Face of God in Each Other and want to move on to Sacred Ground. They are all fantastic. And just as J2A kind of depends on the commitment and the creativity of the trainer, the same thing goes for racial justice curricula. It depends on what you bring to it. So it's not so much finding the perfect thing, but realizing that you've got a lot to lean on. So I know you've got tons of questions, but that was like a great overview. And there is resources in this document, but also I've got a PDF that is 6 pages long. And I'm happy to think through with you or answer questions about where to go next, what might work for you, or just any sort of questions or frustrations you have.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That is wonderful. And if it's okay with you, I will also provide that PDF to everyone so that they have that. Just turning to a couple of the questions that are coming up. Someone asked, what resources are there for helping with congregational audits to look at structural racism within the church itself?
Excellent.
Do you have experience with those?
So I hope that's a leading question. The last General Convention authorized an Episcopal-wide audit that is broken down into 2 levels. It's been going on for 3 years and is about to be published in the next month or so. Those documents done in consultation with some Episcopal research entities are going to be up for the whole church to use and borrow. And I love a good study. I love a good audit. we are totally open to letting you have the sort of the back end, the recipe for those questions. So you've probably seen your diocese and your province doing that work to fill in that data. But those questions are great and great ways to ask yourselves as a congregation or a community as well. And if you can't wait till it gets published this spring, send me an email and I'll see if I can get you a copy.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thanks so much. We'll circle back to the land acknowledgement one, because it sounds like you, Reverend Brown, have some experience with that too. So, but first I wanted to go to the question about, I think there's curiosity about what specifically you meant about the world looking different than a few weeks ago. Because they're thinking about the perspectives of those who have been silenced, oppressed, or threatened for quite some time.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, there's a little bit of what will happen when people who perhaps are sort of long-term activists or pushing for an agenda where we can realize a different version of holding our nation accountable for some of our past wrongs and brokenness. And so there's lots of folks who are on probably one side of thinking, what happens after, perhaps you want to call it victory, or after agenda is brought to the table? That does change some things. When the president of the United States mentions things like racial injustice and white supremacy, does it change our expectations? Does it mean that we have to do a little bit more and go further? Perhaps it frees us up to have those conversations. And on the other side, you might have realized, like I said, as I did, sort of, oh, there are people who use these words very differently. What does it mean to be a citizen or a neighbor or to have history or heritage? And so that's a little awareness as well that makes us think, perhaps to pay attention to the things that are our assumptions of who we are and what we believe in and what's right and wrong. Because you know what? People always need to say, you never have to stop saying the obvious. This is why, this is who we are, this is what we believe. But yeah. Lots of changes going on in the world. Oh my goodness, there's so many questions.
I know, they're coming hard and fast now, which is awesome.
Should we do one more real quick or?
Yeah, sure. So someone mentioned that they are a young person working in the church and they feel like they don't have a whole lot of street cred yet in the parish, but they're wondering about how to push their church, even just the staff at this point, to think about doing real justice work.
Yeah, I think that there's a little bit of a genius to Episcopal sort of formation pedagogy, and that we are really, really good about valuing experiential learning. We're all really smart, but we sort of instinctively know that just having a lot of book knowledge, even about racial justice, doesn't quite serve as compellingly as learning to tell a holy story. And so if you're a fan of like Kinde X or something, and think about the story of, even if you don't have street cred, where you can articulate how injustice, or even being a part of a racialized culture, even if you are a white, male, cisgendered person, there's a place where you can articulate your own perception, your journey, whereas, you know, something about being in our racialized culture has handed you the ammunition to both hurt yourself and replicate the way our culture hurts each other. And then as people who are following the gospel, we have nothing but compulsion to stop that cycle, to break that cycle and do it in the name of the Jesus movement and the one we follow. So telling that holy story, and just if you can be really clear about how your formation has shaped you, how the cultural expectations of race and sex and all kinds of injustice have perhaps limited you or even given you the words to stop the hurt for others, I hope that would give your community and your parish the sort of ammunition to learn to do that themselves and to find a vision of racial justice and global justice for themselves as well. Yeah. But let me know how that turns out. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I know we do have a couple of several other questions in the Q&A, but we will come back to some of those a little bit further into our webinar. At this point, I want to turn it over to Reverend Claire Brown.
Thank you, Catherine. Yeah, so that wisdom from Reverend Melanie about the experiential learning is actually a perfect segue. For those of you who are working with children and youth and families, which is anyone who's working in a parish or the church, this is actually a lifelong faith work. Bring the lens that you already have as a faith education practitioner and bring it to this work of anti-racism. That means knowing that it can begin with babies and toddlers, and there is always room for adult beginners. There are new sets of challenges and questions. Your comments, Reverend Mullen, about literacy, I think is a really helpful framework for thinking about how we learn this. That's something that hopefully readers read their whole lives. They begin when they're children and they see other people putting it into practice. And then it's a skill that will acquire and open new windows for the rest of our lives. And just like we think about faith formation as a lifelong pursuit that doesn't reach a final conclusion point, the work of Christian anti-racism, especially for white anti-racism work, as people who are raised in it and steeped in it, is never a work that we will reach a conclusion point or an achievement that we have now completed that and we are done. I'm so glad so many folks wanted to be at this webinar, but we would be so remiss if we thought this webinar would just fix it, that you went to the webinar and now you're good. No, of course not. You wouldn't think that way about our faith or your relationship with Christ. Likewise, this is a lifelong work, more than what one event or one book or even a handful of ministry changes might be. And when we look at faith formation, we also think a lot about capacity building. That might be taking forms of emotional intelligence work with your parish or your congregation or community or diocese. Understanding emotional relationships, where you end and I begin, what I'm responsible for, how does trauma affect me and my community, what is me and what is culture. All of those are things that help us better be the body of Christ. And guess what? That's also the kind of capacity building that helps us do anti-racism. There are other pedagogical values that we bring in. Curiosity and empathy are game changers because true empathy actually always comes with accountability. Critical engagement of sources. This is a realm where there are so many incredible sources. It's not, as Reverend Mullen was saying, about finding the perfect one or the best one. And at the same time, there is a lot of material out there that's really unhelpful. And so knowing how to find good curriculum, good source material is really helpful and important, just like it would be for choosing a Bible study of other curricula that you use in your parish. We always bring an eye toward how does our faith live out in our day-to-day life. Again, the same. This work of anti-racism is not theoretical. It's something that we need to start living out into the systems and communities in the places where we know inequity persists. And with that too, thinking about lifelong learning, all these different capacities, none of those capacities are contained to one age group, right? I'm raising small children and my 4-year-old is one of the most empathetic people I've ever met. It's really just a matter of considering age and development appropriate considerations for engaging this work. There's all kinds of incredible resources we can point you to about early and middle childhood exposure and ways of thinking about this. But these language conversations and capacity building can start earlier than you think. As I'm raising kids in my community, I'm finding that white parents, by and large, think that the starting point should be a lot later than Black moms and other parents of color. The conversations that we're having with our kids, even if they're hard, even if they make us really uncomfortable, even if they need some big adaptations for understanding, that doesn't mean that our kids don't need it. And it doesn't mean that they aren't ready to begin. And as we look at what it is to do this work across generations, I appreciate the case study so much because it looks at different cultural capacities of our different generations. This week we were celebrating the life of Martin Luther King Jr. And I saw a note that if he were still living, he would be turning 92 this year. Is that right? Is my math right on that? 95? He would be in his 90s, which is an unusual age and yet not terribly rare. This is a concrete reminder to us that people who marched with Dr. King, people who shaped his thought, people who were peers and directly engaged in landmark civil rights actions are part of our communities. There is such deep generational wisdom in our churches, in our dioceses, in our cities. And we need the profound empathy and imagination that children bring to movement work, right? And we need the young people who are teens and young adults and folks who don't have children but have a lot of energy, who can give a lot of time to this. We need everybody in between. So this is a multi-generational effort. All these different voices, different ages, bring different wisdom. And we need all this collective wisdom so that we can do this well. Go into the next slide. With this work, I really encourage you to look local. In our preparation for this webinar, we were chuckling about the differences of living in Tennessee, where I live and work and minister, and being in DC. The work of truth and justice and healing is going to look so profoundly different in different contexts. And now I see that so many people have come to this webinar from even more than one country across the United States. I'm from the Southeast. I grew up in Georgia, have lived my adult life in Tennessee. I am aware that anti-racism is often construed as being a Southern issue, but we know that that is not the case. We just have a particular story of it. All communities are connected to this work because we know that all human liberation is bound up in each other. The oppression of someone in my community, whether near or far, whether I know them or not, is my harm too. We are all called to this and to find what this looks like in our contexts. And so we find that both the racial injustices of our context, of what happened in Chattanooga, Tennessee, of our stories of segregation and harm and violence, that's going to be the stories that I'm called to reckon with in my community. You'll need to find your own. But there are also stories of liberation in all of our communities too. They are often sometimes difficult to unearth, but they are there. They are there. Find your church historian, find your local library history person. Those are the people who know these stories, and we need them. They are the bread and butter that will nourish us and give us sustenance for the work we're called to do. And as we look at this work, just a reminder that as we look local or regional, state, local, parish, family, maybe, this is also active work. So many of our parishes, I've never met a parish or a priest or a pastor who wasn't in some way engaged in community outreach work. That work is often anti-racism. You might just not be in a community that is using that vocabulary for it. But I do encourage folks, as you think about this material, as you think about, well, is my church's outreach ministry to our local school or in neighborhood development, are those part of anti-racism? Bring some of these things to analyze the work that you're doing. Ask what community members are benefiting from our church's outreach. Who's setting the vision? Is this our idea of what someone else needs? Or are people setting the tone for what they need? And who's in the conversation? We know that ministries of outreach and social action can develop over time and need ongoing conversation with the folks who are most impacted by issues. Make sure that those stakeholders accurately represent the racial makeup of the community that you are serving. Next slide, please. So when we think about anti-racism work, one of the ways that we are formed is by often unspoken representation in spaces and imagery. We see that so powerfully in the Richmond case study, where we have not just a white Moses, but a white Moses who is in fact Robert E. Lee. And so when we think about, I'm going to skip bullets around a little bit to draw this together. When we think about our worship spaces or our formation spaces, you know, think how many of you have images of apostles or Mother Mary or Jesus or Old Testament figures in your worship space? How many of those accurately represent the ethnic reality of our religion based in the ancient Near East? Probably very few. And while I am not saying go punch out those beautiful stained glass windows, I am saying that we have some work to do to make sure that our choices moving ahead in representation and artwork actually look like what Jesus looked like. And then we also need to be mindful of the people, the bodies and the voices that are forming and leading in our community. So who's leading your parish, your congregation, your diocese? Again, remembering that our denomination is overwhelmingly white, and then our multiracial congregations where people are actually integrated in a worship space are fairly few. So it's not as much about revolutionizing the race of the priest in your church as it is looking at who are the voices coming together, where are your community collaborations, who are you choosing, those of you who have this power, to bring in as a guest preacher or speaker. Who's writing the curriculum? Who is the person teaching on the video that you've chosen for your next series? And then what sources are we using in our preaching and our teaching? Are we attending to our own continuing development as church professionals? And are we looking to voices that might be challenging some of our assumptions, stretching us to think in new perspectives that don't match our own? And as we look honestly at those places that we're being formed, it's also important to look honestly at our legacies and stories. A really helpful project that I commend to everyone is the Roberson Project at Swanee. They ran a workshop, I guess about a year and a half ago, on Confederate symbols in Episcopal churches, recognizing that in the context of the Southeast, churches of a certain age were likely either possessing Confederate symbols within their churches, or they themselves, just by nature of being historic landmarks, are symbols of the Confederacy. Whoa. Take a couple deep breaths with that. We're not going to stay there long because we have to keep moving in this webinar. But that's a lot to dig into. That can be overwhelming. But it's really important to tell the truth about these stories. That means knowing who are the portraits of. Do we have portraits of people that we really want to uphold? Or is it just there because it's been there? Who is the name on the plaque? What is their legacy? Now, again, I'm not saying that means we need to strip out all of these symbols, but it does mean we need to tell the whole truth. We need to reckon with these things. We need to grieve them. And the next slide. And for those of you who are engaged in preaching and teaching, is one of the most consistent avenues of formation, especially during pandemic. That kind of direct communication is more important than ever when we're missing some of the community gathering space where we're embodying faith together in the same way. We are going to send out a lot of really good resources and strategies, but I wanted to elevate just a few that have been really helpful for me. The work of Becoming Beloved Community that Reverend Mullen is engaged in is a huge practical tool with seasonal resources for formation, all kinds of great video. I mean, just so much there, so many toolkits, great things to dig into. For white preachers and teachers who want to do some of this work, there's a podcast called The Word is Resistance, and it's actually a lectionary-based exegesis from the lens of white anti-racist work. I'm a contributor to that, so it's kind of a plug, but it's also a really great diverse cast of contributors to that are really helpful. And then finally, Reverend Dr. Dale Andrews, the late Reverend Dr. Dale Andrews, was one of my professors at Vanderbilt Divinity School, and he has a lectionary commentary series. And it is not just focused on racial justice, but intersections of many kinds of justice movement work. And it's a fabulous tool for preparing to preach or teach. All different voices, I rely on it almost every week. But as you start to engage these things in your preaching and teaching, in the avenues you already have, leaning into the intersections of faith formation and anti-racist work, a few things that I wanted to note that I've experienced, just so that you're prepared. If you're new to this work, prepare for energy. Prepare, as Reverend Mullen saw, to have people saying, okay, well, what do we do? Tell us what to do. Let's get to work. Dr. Christina Cleveland calls this the blitz stage of anti-racist work, where you're almost exploding, wanting to fix and get into it. That can be incredibly helpful if it's channeled well, but can also benefit from some deep breaths and some slowing down. Another thing to prepare for is for failure. The failure of anti-racism, especially for white folks, is excruciating, and it is shame-filled, and it is clumsy, and it's messy, and it can keep us from ever starting. But we have to start. We have to start somewhere. So let us begin knowing that there is grace and grace and grace for doing this work incompletely, but we must do it. And finally, prepare for pushback. You would not be the only person as a preacher or teacher feeling confusion or shame, or where do I begin? Your congregation, your community will too. Again, emotional intelligence is a critical tool for navigating this in your community, and also doing it together. Remembering that we cannot do this in isolation, but we need each other's voices to build together. And finally, prepare for continued conversation. I can't emphasize enough that this is not a one and done. This is not just a Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebration as your yearly goal. This is not one webinar, not one book study, but looking for times that your community is called to return to this work in fresh ways, to explore it in new directions, to weave it into other work that your community is doing. Continue the conversation.
Wow, thank you so much, both of you. This is so rich. There's so many amazing tidbits in here and ideas for folks. And just to reassure you all who are attending, the resources will be not too extensive. I have to admit, I started putting things in and I got carried away, and I was like, you need to pare it back a little bit, Catherine. And so just because the resource that you're looking for isn't there doesn't mean we're not aware of it. So please reach out, but we didn't want to sort of overwhelm. So just know that we're resources to you all going forward as well. Lots of great questions here. Let's go ahead and do the one about land acknowledgement. Do either of you have experience with locations where there are, it seems like multiple First Nations have inhabited the land? How do we do that right in order to really honor all of those groups?
That's a great question. I can only speak kind of from what I've seen done that felt like it was done well and with consideration, but I welcome others' feedback. What I've seen is, because when we are looking at Indigenous rights and liberation movements, there is such a horrific erasure of history and culture that actually that information can be hard to track down. And so I think there is an element of humanity and humility to say, so for instance, I would say I'm Claire and I live on what I think was Creek or Cherokee land. And a way to say that history was so erased and destroyed and not prioritized that it is difficult to name exactly and precisely. And also understanding that the little lot in a subdivision that I live in is a very white Western way of thinking about relationship to land that is very white and in some ways violent within the Indigenous framework.
Yeah, that's really it's compelling. And thanks for bringing up how complicated that is. And I do know our staff officer for race relations, Shaniqua Broken Leg, whose email is in that PDF, is also an Indigenous person and has worked with like sort of dioceses or perhaps a province as they craft their land acknowledgement. And I love this reminder that not to think of it as a performance or even a liturgical piece with a rubric that you have to get right. And Reverend Brookleg is more than open actually to, if you've got something tricky or complicated like multiple land acknowledgements, reach out and would be very happy to sort of talk you through how that might happen in a really complicated space. But yeah, lots to consider. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. Let's see. So someone was asking, they're saying they're not Episcopalian, but what are some of the best resources for working with children? When we were together in person, they were using more of scripture and anti-racist children's literature. And of course, now that we're digital, yes, some books you can get the proper permissions to do online, but that is a complex world to jump into. So do you have ideas for the best children's ministry or resources for working with children?
Reverend Mullen, do you have any? I don't want to jump over you.
No, don't. You're not.
Okay. So two really great things that I lean on as a mom are it's actually a Methodist curriculum. So it's called Deep Blue Life. And they have a series of lessons that are on anti-racism work. Their curriculum is downloadable from the Cokesbury website per lesson. So it's actually quite affordable and reasonable for a family or a church, even with the smallest budget, to just get a handful of lessons to have those stories, vocabulary, and activities on hand. And within that, they also have several lessons that are in their series on Cloud of Witnesses, all different saints, official or not. And many of those are Black, Indigenous, and people of color that would be tremendous resources. An online free website that I love, I can follow them on Instagram and get little updates, is called The Conscious Kid. And it is fantastic. It is constantly stretching my imagination, helping me really practically with language for children. The Conscious Kid is great.
And the only ones I would add to that would be Talking Kids and Race, which is online, has got downloadable pieces within there. And in the website for the Episcopal Church / Racial Reconciliation, there are a list of books, and there are 2 or 3 of those are focused on multi-generational, so not explicitly for children. So thanks so much for your child-specific suggestions. We have to add those to our list.
Absolutely. And as we're going, must confess, I'm getting really excited about all the resources and the questions about resources. So forgive me if the email doesn't come tomorrow. It's only because I'm still working on the list and making it as awesome for you as we can. So just be aware of that. Reverend Mullen, do you mind putting that first title in the chat, please? Someone was asking about that. So someone mentioned that they are leading a Sacred Ground circle, and this is their, I think, second time doing it. And each circle that they've done has only had one man present in the group. And so the question is, do you have any sense how to engage more white men who seem to be well represented on vestries or boards in church contexts, but how to engage them with the work of anti-racism in the parish or the church?
That's a good question. That's one I don't think we've ever really encountered that way before. I have 2 instincts. One is, before I went to seminary, I worked for legal diversity and inclusion and leadership sectors. And so there's a basic strategy of getting leaders to get invested and doing DEI work or racial equity work. And part of it is to make sure that the most senior leadership articulate very clearly again and again, we are doing this because. Why are we doing this? Because we want our church to be relevant, because we want to be people of Christ. And to that inculcate a sense that there's an expectation for those who are vestry members or committee chairs to understand the same things that the head of the parish or the head of the institution understand. But the other side, I love that you brought up the fact that there might be a gender disparity or some indication that perhaps the space does not feel as safe or as productive for some as for others. And it might look very differently. I mean, I'm thinking about men, you're thinking about people with resources and means. Perhaps there is a way to sort of, once again, ask the community, what will it take for you to feel functional in this space? Where do you see yourself in this space? I know that a lot of times when people study DEI or reconciliation and racial work in the business context, lots of times people are pushed away when the thought of something is compulsive or compulsory, or is telling people what to think or how to do. That feels very uncomfortable for some folks, but you won't know until you ask. But I would love to explore that with you further, because once again, that's a new one for us. If there's an extreme gender imbalance in your circle, we should think about how we communicate in a way that works well for folks no matter their background. Sorry.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There are still quite a number of questions, but so I apologize, we will not get to all of them, but maybe we will do one more that I think could be helpful to folks. How do you approach groups that are at very different points in their journey in learning about anti-racism? And this person is specifically asking about working with high schoolers, but I would say that with any age group also. Thoughts on that?
Oh, well, with the high schoolers, I know a great resource thanks to our youth and family minister that is the Absalom Jones Center training for youth. It is actually incredibly accessible and I think would be engaging for adults as well. So I commend that to anyone who's working with teenagers or just looking for an entry point. But I think foregrounding some of the work around emotional intelligence really is critical. Can you tell that's my soapbox? I think, reminding people that this is messy and difficult, but there doesn't need to be shame, and that we all learn language around this in different ways. I think folks like myself who really love the academic side and the thinking through and the writing and researching pieces can get into a lot of trouble if we think that this is only for people who want to talk like they're in a graduate seminar. But this is the work of love and justice and kindness and hope in something different. And that is not exclusive. And so reminding people that this is a process is crucial. And I think also having a multiple venue approach. So our parish has done courses, we've done book studies in small groups, we've done a pilgrimage. We went to Montgomery to the EJI Museum. We've done some liturgical adaptations, from a digital evening prayer for Martin Luther King this week to there's a place where a man was lynched in our town and about 103 years ago. And we went and had a sort of adapted funeral at his graveside. And the same people, there's a few people who come to all of those things, but by and large, we're finding lots of different people are plugging in and connecting in different ways, just according to where they are in their faith and what speaks to them. So I think multiple approaches, compassion, slowing it down.
I love that. Thank you for that reminder. It gets back to what I sort of sense is the heart of what we as Episcopalians tend to do well in our formation, is sort of leaning into the experiential aspect of it. So folks, either be it intergenerationally or different ends of an expertise spectrum, can all still feel that they are authentically keying into some aspects of what you're trying to convey. Now, that being said, it is also very helpful as a community that you can articulate some, be it standards or benchmarks of what it is like for folks to achieve that literacy and to achieve sort of a mastery of concepts. Just the way that your children's Bible study, Little Bible, is a great way to experience and know God. It might not be your understanding of the book of Deuteronomy. We want to be able to say that for folks, that we are growing and there are some benchmarks or things we want to learn how to do. But that's the good news of this work. Once we can have a solid definition of what racism is and what anti-racism is, then we're able to understand the world around us better. But we can still operate in the world if we can't describe how it's all working. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. As I said, there are so many great resources and we're really excited to provide those to you. If by chance I don't get the email out to you tomorrow, it's because I'm still working on the list, because I'm getting more and more excited as we talk. So, but we do want to respect your time, and we know that it's been about an hour. I want to thank both of our panelists. You all have been wonderful, so thank you. I also want to tell you, so you can get a preview of some of the resources, but don't worry, I'm going to flesh that out more. I also wanted to let you know that we expect to have another webinar about using saints and holy days to teach the faith at home next month. So you can find, I'll try to include the sign up for that in the resources that I send out to you. And I wanted to thank you all for coming, for being part of this. You'll see that there's a little email us thing here that if you click on that, you can send an email to yours truly with any feedback or ideas you might have for us. And we're just grateful to you for being here and engaging in this work with us. So thank you. And I apologize that we didn't get to all of your wonderful questions. Please do send me an email. This is one of my greatest passions to talk about this. I will prioritize your email, I promise. So thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.